Before the South ever admitted slavery was dying, two boys born in chains on a Mississippi plantation quietly declared war on it and won. They were twins, identical in face but dangerous in purpose. The masters thought they were harmless field hands, interchangeable, forgettable. What no one noticed was that the twins were watching everything: the schedules, the punishments, the lies the slaveholders told each other to stay in power. One learned how men spoke when they believed no one important was listening. The other learned how fear traveled faster than truth. By the 1890s, when the world claimed slavery was already over, Mississippi was still bleeding from it. Through debt bondage, forced labor, and laws designed to keep black men trapped. And that's when the twins began their war. Not with guns, not with open rebellion, but with deception so precise it turned slave catchers against plantation owners, owners against overseers, and entire counties against themselves. Rumors started where the twins passed through. Records went missing. Men swore they'd seen fugitives in places that didn't exist. Rewards were paid for slaves who were never there. Plantations emptied as paranoia spread. Overseers were fired. Owners accused one another of secretly helping runaways. The system began eating itself alive. No one ever realized there were two of them. By the time authorities understood something was wrong, hundreds had vanished north. Labor camps collapsed. Profits dried up. And the twins, born property, listed once as assets, walked away as free men, leaving behind a broken machine that could no longer hold anyone. This is the true story of the Mississippi slave twins who didn't just escape slavery. They outwitted it, dismantled it, and won the war from the inside. The Mississippi ran thick and brown that summer of 1890, carrying memories in its muddy waters like secrets it refused to surrender. Along its banks, in a ramshackle cabin that leaned toward the water as if thirsting for escape, lived Sarah and Samuel Freeman, twins born into a world that had promised them freedom but delivered only its shadow. They were 25 years old that year, born in 1865, just as the war everyone called the war between the states was gasping its last breath. Their mother, Esther, had been freed by Lincoln's proclamation, but freedom on paper meant little when you had nowhere to go and nothing to your name. She'd stayed on the same plantation where she'd been enslaved, working for wages so meager they might as well have been invisible, raising her twins in a cabin that the rain visited as regularly as the sunrise. Sarah and Samuel were identical in a way that unsettled people. Not in appearance. Sarah was willowy where Samuel was broad, her face softened by full cheeks, while his was all angles and determination. But they shared something deeper, a way of knowing each other's thoughts, of finishing each other's sentences, of feeling each other's pain across distances. Old folks said it was because they'd shared their mother's womb during the darkest days, when Esther had labored in the fields until the very day they arrived, her water breaking between rows of cotton that drank it down like rain. The twins had grown up hearing their mother's stories of bondage, though Esther spoke of them rarely and only in whispers, as if the words themselves might summon those days back into being. But they lived the aftermath every day. The plantation owner's son, Thomas Hutchins, had inherited the land and ran it with the same iron fist his father had used, only now he called the workers tenant farmers and paid them in scrip good only at his store, where prices climbed higher than any of them could count. It was slavery by another name, Sarah often said, and Samuel always agreed. The twins had taught themselves to read using a Bible left behind by a northern missionary and whatever newspapers blew through town. Like tumbleweeds, they read about Reconstruction's promises and its betrayals, about the Hayes Compromise that had pulled federal troops from the South and left people like them to the mercy of people like Thomas Hutchins. They read about Jim Crow laws spreading across the South like kudzu, about voting rights stripped away through poll taxes and literacy tests designed for failure, about separate rail cars and separate schools and separate water fountains, as if freedom could be segregated into submission. But in that summer of 1890, they read something else. Scattered reports from across the South of people organizing, of secret meetings in churches and midnight gatherings in fields, of a movement growing quietly like roots beneath the soil. The stories were fragmentary, often buried in the back pages, where editors thought no one would notice, but Sarah and Samuel noticed everything. "Listen to this," Sarah said one evening, holding a week-old copy of a Memphis newspaper they'd traded 3 eggs for. "Says here there's been coordinated work stoppages in Alabama, entire work crews refusing to labor until wages are paid in real money instead of scrip." Samuel looked up from the fishing net he was mending, his fingers stilling. "They have any success?" "Doesn't say." "But Sam, that's the 3rd story like this I found in a month. Something's happening." "Something's always happening," their mother said from the corner where she sat shelling peas, her voice carrying the weight of years that had taught her caution. "Question is whether it helps or just brings trouble down." But the twins exchanged a look, that silent communication that flowed between them like current in the river, and they both knew trouble was already here. The question was whether they would face it on their knees or on their feet. The idea came to them simultaneously, as their ideas often did, during a stifling August night when sleep was impossible, and they sat on the cabin's tilting porch watching heat lightning dance across the horizon. "We could organize here," Sarah said. "Everyone who works these fields," Samuel continued, "everyone who's paid in scrip and charged twice what things are worth. If we all stopped together, they couldn't replace all of us, not in harvest season." They planned through the night, their voices low, their minds moving in tandem like dancers who'd practiced the same steps their entire lives. By dawn, they had the skeleton of something audacious, a coordinated action that would unite every worker on every plantation along their stretch of the Mississippi, timed to the cotton harvest when landowners were most vulnerable, most desperate to bring in their crops before weather or insects could destroy them. It would take months to organize. They would have to move carefully, secretly, because Thomas Hutchins and men like him had eyes and ears everywhere, and the penalty for troublemaking could be anything from eviction to a lynching. Sarah would approach the women, Samuel the men, but they would work together always, 2 halves of the same whole, impossible to divide. They started with their mother's friends, the women she'd known since their shared days of bondage. They met in kitchens while kneading bread, in washhouses while scrubbing clothes, in chicken coops while gathering eggs. Sarah spoke in low, urgent tones about dignity and fair wages, about the power they held if only they would recognize it and use it together. Samuel worked the fields and the fishing banks, the places where men gathered after their day's labor, too tired to go home immediately, needing a moment to simply exist without someone ordering them about. He spoke of the stories they'd read, of successful actions in other places, of the simple mathematics. There were hundreds of them and dozens of landowners, and their labor was what made the cotton grow, or at least made it profitable. Slowly, carefully, they built a network. Code words were established. The rivers rising meant there was news to share. The fishing's good meant a meeting was planned. They used children as messengers, knowing that a child running between plantations attracted less suspicion than an adult. They used songs, old spirituals from slavery days, with new verses that spoke of unity and action woven into familiar melodies. By October, they had nearly 300 people ready to act. The plan was set for the first week of November, when the cotton would be at its peak readiness, when any delay in harvest could mean financial disaster for the plantation owners. But 3 days before the planned action, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Thomas Hutchins's foreman, a cruel man named Pike, who enforced the landowner's will with fists and worse, cornered Sarah on an isolated path between the cotton fields and the cabins. What he intended was clear from his words and his grabbing hands. What he didn't expect was that Sarah carried a fishing knife in her pocket, Samuel's knife actually, which she'd borrowed that morning and forgotten to return. One of those small coincidences that change everything. She didn't think. She simply moved, the blade flashing in the afternoon sun, catching Pike across the forearm when he reached for her. It wasn't a deep cut, but it was enough to make him stagger back, cursing, blood dripping into the dusty earth. Sarah ran. She ran like the river in flood, like wind before a storm, her feet barely touching ground until she reached the cabin where Samuel was waiting, where he knew immediately from her face that everything had changed. "We have to move now," she gasped. "Tonight, before Hutchins finds out and comes for me." Their mother overheard, emerging from the cabin with flour on her hands and fear in her eyes. "Child, what have you done?" "What I had to do, Mama, what I should have been able to do without fearing for my life after." Samuel was already moving, his mind racing through possibilities, adjustments to their careful plans. "I'll send the word. We move tonight, all of us, every field, every plantation. We don't show up for work tomorrow, and we don't go back until we have guarantees, real wages, paid in real money, and an end to the violence." "They'll bring the law down on us," Esther said, her voice shaking. "The law's already against us, Mama," Sarah replied. "Has been all our lives. At least this way, we're choosing the battle." The messengers went out as the sun set, carrying word that the river was rising, that the fishing was better than it had ever been, that everyone should gather at the old riverside meeting ground, a clearing by the water where camp meetings had been held in the days before the war, when enslaved people had been allowed to worship one Sunday a month under the watchful eyes of overseers. They came in twos and threes, in families, alone, moving through the darkness like water finding its course. By midnight, the clearing held nearly 400 people, more than the twins had dared hope, representing every plantation within a day's walk of the river. Samuel and Sarah stood on a fallen log that served as a natural platform, and in the light of carefully shielded lanterns, they addressed the gathering. We're here because we're tired, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Tired of working dawn to dusk for wages we can't spend anywhere but the company store. Tired of seeing our children go hungry while we harvest food for other people's tables. Tired of being free in name but slaves in fact. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Samuel took up the thread. Tomorrow, we don't go to the fields. We don't harvest their cotton or tend their livestock or cook their meals or wash their clothes. We stop, all of us together, and we stay stopped until they agree to pay us fairly and treat us like the human beings we are. They'll starve us out, someone called from the crowd. We'll fish the river and share what we catch, Samuel replied. We'll tend our own gardens and share what we grow. We've survived worse than this. We'll survive this too. They'll bring violence, another voice added. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the fear. They might. Probably will. But there are hundreds of us and dozens of them. We are not asking for a fight, but we are not running from one either. We stand together, we look after each other, and we don't back down. An older man, someone who'd been enslaved until he was nearly 40, stood up. His name was Moses, and people listened when he spoke. I remember the day I heard I was free, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I remember thinking my children would grow up different than I did. But my grandbaby works the same fields I did, for a master who pays him in paper he can't use anywhere else. That ain't freedom. These twins are right. If we don't stand now, when do we? Stand? The murmur became a rumble of assent. One by one, people stood, signaling their commitment. Not everyone. There were some who slipped away into the darkness, afraid or unconvinced. But most stayed, and when dawn broke over the Mississippi, the fields remained empty, and the plantation owners woke to a silence they hadn't heard since before the war. The first 3 days were almost easy. The plantation owners, accustomed to being obeyed, seemed unable to believe that a work stoppage would continue. They sent messages threatening eviction, offering tiny concessions, demanding meetings. The twins, now the acknowledged leaders of what people were starting to call the River Action, refused every partial offer and held firm to their demands. On the 4th day, Thomas Hutchins arrived at the riverside meeting ground with a dozen armed men. The workers had lookouts posted, and word of the approach spread quickly. By the time Hutchins arrived, he found himself facing not scattered, fearful group, but an organized wall of people standing shoulder to shoulder, with Sarah and Samuel at the center. This is illegal assembly, Hutchins declared, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who'd never been seriously challenged. You're trespassing on private property and you're in violation of your work contracts. Disperse now or face the consequences. Samuel stepped forward. We're on public land by the river, Mr. Hutchins. No trespassing here. As for contracts, show us where we signed anything that says we accept scrip instead of real wages. Your continued employment is contract enough, Hutchins sputtered. Sarah joined her brother. Then we're ending that employment, all of us, until the terms change. We're happy to work, Mr. Hutchins. We're just not happy to be cheated. Hutchins's face reddened. You think you can threaten me? You think there aren't consequences for this kind of insubordination? That foreman you cut, Sarah Freeman, he's sworn out. A complaint. The sheriff's coming for you." "Then let him come," Sarah said calmly. "Let him come and hear why I had a knife in my hand when your foreman cornered me on a lonely path. Let him ask what Pike intended when he grabbed me. Let the whole county hear about it." The armed men with Hutchins shifted uncomfortably. Whatever they'd been told, this wasn't what they'd expected. Not this calm defiance, not this many people standing united. Hutchins opened his mouth, closed it, then turned on his heel. "This isn't over," he spat. "You're making a mistake you'll all regret." But when he left without violence, and that felt like a victory. It was a short-lived feeling. That night, riders came, masked men carrying torches, riding through the small settlements where the workers lived, burning 3 cabins to the ground. No one was killed, but the message was clear. The landowners would escalate rather than negotiate. The twins called an emergency gathering. Some people wanted to respond with violence of their own. Others wanted to give up, to return to work before more was destroyed. The community teetered on the edge of fracturing. It was their mother, Esther, who steadied them. She stood before the gathering, this woman who'd survived bondage and its aftermath, and she spoke with the authority that silenced everyone. "I was born a slave," she said, "lived as a slave for 35 years, got my freedom and found it wasn't quite what I dreamed. But it was something. It was a start. What my children are doing here, what you're all doing, this is the next step. Yes, they'll try to scare us. That's what they've always done. But every time we stay scared, every time we back down, we teach our children that freedom isn't for people like us. I say we stay. I say we stand. I say we show them that we're not afraid anymore." The twins looked at their mother with new eyes, seeing not just the woman who'd raised them, but a warrior who'd survived a war and wasn't finished fighting. The vote was nearly unanimous. They would continue. What the plantation owners hadn't counted on was the attention. The twins had sent letters to newspapers, to sympathetic politicians, to ministers and activists in the North. As days turned to weeks and the standoff continued, reporters began to arrive, curious about this coordinated action in the heart of Mississippi. The stories they sent back painted a picture that made the landowners uncomfortable. Hundreds of formerly enslaved people, 25 years after emancipation, still effectively bound to the land by economic chains, now standing together and demanding basic dignity. In an era when the North was largely content to forget about the South's problems, these stories stirred old consciences. Sarah and Samuel proved to be articulate spokespeople, able to explain their position in terms that Northern readers found compelling. They didn't ask for charity or intervention. They asked only that the law apply equally, that contracts be honored, that violence be prosecuted rather than ignored. Money began to arrive. Small donations from churches and aid societies, enough to buy real food from nearby towns, enough to help rebuild the burned cabins. More importantly, lawyers arrived, offering to represent the workers in their contract disputes, to file charges against the men who'd burned homes and terrorized families. The plantation owners found themselves in an unexpected bind. The cotton still needed harvesting, but they couldn't find enough workers to replace the ones who'd stopped. Bringing in workers from other areas was expensive and complicated. Meanwhile, their crop was rotting in the fields, and every day of delay cost them money. Behind closed doors, They began to negotiate. The talks were tense, mediated by a federal judge who traveled from New Orleans, curious about this unusual case. The landowners wanted the workers to return immediately, promising to consider better terms later. The twins and the committee they'd formed held firm. No return without guaranteed wages in currency. No return without written contracts that spelled out fair terms. No return without prosecution of the men who'd committed violence. "You're bankrupting us," Thomas Hutchins complained during one session. "You've been bankrupting us our entire lives," Samuel replied. "The difference is we're doing it legally." The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. A lawyer representing several northern banks that held mortgages on the plantations pointed out that if the harvest was lost entirely, the landowners would default on their loans, the banks would foreclose, and the workers would be dealing with new ownership anyway. Ownership that might be more amenable to fair terms if that was the price of a productive workforce. Faced with losing everything, the plantation owners blinked first. The agreement, signed on a cold December morning, with the Taos Mississippi River fog-wrapped around the meeting ground, wasn't everything the workers had hoped for, but it was something real, something tangible, something they could build on. Real wages paid in United States currency, not scrip. Written contracts specifying fair terms, with provisions for arbitration of disputes, investment in schools for the workers' children, and perhaps most importantly, prosecution of the men who'd burned the cabins and terrorized the community. When Sarah and Samuel signed the document on behalf of the workers, their hands trembling slightly as they wrote their names, they weren't just signing a labor agreement. They were signing proof that coordinated action could work, that standing together was possible, that the story of freedom didn't end with emancipation, but continued in 10,000 small battles like this one. News of the River Action, as it came to be known, spread across the South. It didn't start a revolution. The forces of Jim Crow were too entrenched, too powerful, too willing to use violence for that. But it started something. In tobacco fields and rice plantations, in mines and lumber camps, people heard about the twins who'd organized hundreds of workers and won concessions from the landowners. They heard, and some of them began to organize too. The twins never claimed to have won the war against the remnants of slavery. They knew better. They saw the way Jim Crow laws continued to spread, the way voting rights continued to be stripped away, the way violence continued to be used to enforce white supremacy. The struggle they'd begun would continue for generations, through the labor movements of the early 20th century, through the civil rights battles of the 1950s and 60s, through fights still being waged in their distant future. But they'd won a battle, and that mattered. They'd shown that organization was possible, that unity had power, that standing together could achieve what individuals alone could not. Sarah eventually became a teacher, using part of the wages she had fought for to get training, then returning to educate the children in their community. Samuel became an organizer, traveling to other areas, helping other workers understand their power, teaching the lessons the River Action had revealed. Their mother, Esther, lived to see her grandchildren attend the school Sarah founded, learning to read and write, growing up with possibilities she'd never dared to dream of during her years in bondage. The Mississippi kept rolling past their cabin, past the fields where cotton still grew, but was now harvested by people earning fair wages, past the meeting ground where 400 people had stood together and refused to bend. The river carried those memories downstream, carrying the story of what happened when two twins born into freedom's shadow decided that shadow wasn't enough and reached for the light. They didn't win the war against slavery's legacy. That war continues still, fought in different forms, under different names. But they won their battle, and in doing so, they added their thread to the long, complicated tapestry of freedom, proving that the chains that bind aren't just broken by grand proclamations, but by ordinary people making extraordinary choices together. And that, in the end, was victory enough. Years later, when Sarah and Samuel were old, and their children were grown with children of their own, a young historian came to interview them about the river action. He asked them if they'd known it would work, if they'd been certain of success. The twins exchanged that look they still shared, that silent communication that had never faded. "We weren't certain of anything," Sarah said. "Except each other," Samuel added. "And the people who stood with us," Sarah continued. "And that doing nothing wasn't an option anymore," Samuel finished. The historian wrote it all down, preserving their story for future generations who would face their own battles, their own choices between submission and resistance, their own moments when they would have to decide whether to accept the world as it was or fight to make it what it should be. The Mississippi kept rolling past, as it always had, as it always would, carrying memories and secrets, bearing witness to the long, slow, stubborn work of freedom.